Welcome to our channel of bedtime stories. If you love falling asleep to the gentle murmur of captivating tales, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a new story. Drift off with us every night. Tonight, let the whispers of history guide you to enchanted dreams as we journey into the world of a queen whose life shaped an entire era. Born in the shadows of a troubled palace, transformed by love and loss, Queen Victoria's heart beat in rhythm with the fate of an empire. Open your mind and step quietly into a story filled with secrets, grandeur, and the gentle ache of longing. A tale where even the mightiest queen discovers both wonder and sorrow in the hush of the night. Queen Victoria, Shadow and Scepter, a historical epic. The heavy clouds over London on May 24, 1819, seemed to herald more than rain. In the stately Kensington Palace, a wail shattered the silence. With that small, fierce cry, a life began that would reshape the world's greatest empire and define an era so vast and tumultuous, it would bear her name. Chapter 1. The Cradle of Destiny. The infant's mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, cradled her only daughter, her large blue eyes filled with some mixture of hope and resignation. The father, Edward, Duke of Kent, fourth son of the Mad King, George III, clasped his daughter's tiny fist in a hand calloused by war and worry. This was Alexandrina Victoria, a child whose claim to the throne was both distant and extraordinary. Yet, as the years would prove, the fate of the House of Hanover would fall upon her. King George III, lost in the labyrinth of his mind, was a shadow upon the throne. His son, the flamboyant Prince Regent, future George IV, had no living heirs. The royal family, glittering but fractured by scandals, untimely deaths, and desperate marriages, sat upon a crumbling edifice. So, from the moment of her birth, Victoria was watched and watched over with both care and calculation. Kensington Palace, with its lush gardens and walls echoing with secrets of the Hanoverian brood, was both a home and a prison for the young princess. Her mother, aided by the ambitious Sir John Conroy, imported from Germany her own code of conduct, the notorious Kensington system. It was a regimen of control. No walk, no play, no meeting went unsupervised. Victoria's every book was approved, every companion vetted. The princess learned early that trust was both precious and dangerous, an insight that would shape her reign. Young Victoria's only solace came in the arms of her devoted governess, Baroness Louise Lehzen. Lehzen, sharp-spoken and fiercely protective, recognized the loneliness that shaped the girl. They pored over books. They plotted imaginary kingdoms and sketched the faces of dogs that Victoria adored. Lehzen became both shield and sword, preventing Conroy and the Duchess from overwhelming the child with their ambitions. The seeds of independence and of stubbornness were sown in these years. The specter of the crown, initially remote, grew increasingly real with every family tragedy. George IV's estranged daughter, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth. The line thinned. The Duke of Kent himself succumbed to pneumonia when Victoria was but 8 months old. Each funeral further thrust the little princess toward the thrones of England, Ireland, and later, a burgeoning global empire. Her lessons took on new gravitas, with the English people peering curiously at the pale, watchful child in Kensington's gardens. The world seemed to prepare her for greatness, or devour her with expectation. Chapter 2. Dawn of Sovereignty. Perhaps it was inevitable that her destiny would be declared in darkness. It was just past dawn on June 20th, 1837, when Lord Conyngham and the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived at Kensington in urgent secrecy. King William IV, Victoria's uncle, had died in the night. At 18, Victoria was Queen of the United Kingdom. They found her in her nightgown, her voice steady, as they informed her, "Your Majesty, your uncle the King is dead, and you are Queen." Legend has it that she stood trembling, then declared, "I will do my utmost to fulfill my duty." Her first act was decisive. No Conroy, no mother at her side at state business. She would be sovereign in her own right. She moved to Buckingham Palace, making it the seat of the monarchy. The diaries she would keep throughout her life, sprawling, sharp, vividly detailed, recorded her emotions, excitement, fear, and the weight of her lineage. "I am so young, and perhaps in many, many things, inexperienced," she wrote, "but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." Yet behind the ornate doors and gilded mirrors, the young queen faced storms. England in 1837 was a tinderbox of unrest, industrial innovation, and social upheaval. The Chartists demanded democracy. The mills of Manchester belched both smoke and poverty. Ministers plotted quietly, wary of the girl queen and eager to influence her. Even as throngs cheered Victoria in her open carriage, many whispered that a female monarch, especially one so slight and sheltered, would never master the rougher tides of power. And then there was Lord Melbourne. Chapter 3. Melbourne's Shadow. William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, was Prime Minister, a man seasoned by political intrigue, heartbreak, and scandal. He became Victoria's guide, confidant, and first real friend. As her mentor, Melbourne guided her through the constitutional maze. He was patient, witty, and deeply charismatic. For the young queen, whose world had long been restricted, Melbourne was a revelation, half father, half gallant chevalier. Tongues wagged about the tenderness in her letters and the hours spent in his company. Their friendship was both a source of strength and public controversy. Melbourne, aging and haunted by his past, found in Victoria a second youth. She, starved of affection, developed an affection both filial and romantic. Yet, British politics were unkind to sentiment. Melbourne's Whigs were losing power. The crisis of the bedchamber plot, when Victoria, at Melbourne's urging, refused to dismiss her ladies-in-waiting for the incoming Tory government, exposed her inexperience. The newspapers savaged her. Conservative politicians muttered about petticoat government. Adversity, however, forged the young queen's character. She was heartbroken to see Melbourne's resignation, but accepted that her own popularity could not rest on borrowed wisdom alone. She began to seek out her own voice and unwittingly prepare for a partnership that would change not just her life, but the course of empires. Chapter 4. Heart and Empire. At Windsor Castle on October 10, 1839, Victoria's world shifted again. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her German cousin, tall and earnest and shy, arrived for a fateful visit. Victoria recorded in her diary, "It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert, who is most amiable and appears to be extremely sensible and good. It was she, in a rare reversal of courtly ritual, who would propose marriage." Their wedding, on the rain-swept morning of February 10, 1840, was not merely the joining of two young hearts. It was the start of a dynasty, a partnership at once pragmatic and passionate. Albert, a prince of modest fortune but extraordinary vision, would never be merely a consort. Victoria, for whom love and power had always seemed at odds, found in him an intellectual peer, confidant, and anchor. The early years were not easy. The English press, hostile to foreigners, mocked the dear German. Ministers resented Albert's influence. Victoria struggled between daughterly allegiance to her mother and wifely devotion to her husband. The threat of assassination loomed. Within 3 months of her wedding, the young queen was the target of her first would-be assassin, Edward Oxford. She faced him with legendary composure. But the union flourished. Victoria and Albert produced a family that would touch every royal house in Europe. 9 children in all, each a pawn or a peacekeeper in a continent forever tilting toward conflict. Their home at Osborne House brimmed with music, laughter, and experiments. Albert's progressive love of science balancing Victoria's romanticism. London, however, was restless. The city's East End seethed with poverty, even as crystal palaces of industry were raised in the West. The Chartists marched. Irish famine claimed tens of thousands. Through war and revolution abroad, strikes and unrest at home, Victoria's diaries record nights spent in worry for her people. "Everybody expects me to be calm and collected," she wrote, "but I am terribly agitated." Chapter 5. The Making of a Monarch. The 1840s to 1850s saw Victoria transform from a symbol to a leader. She became, under Albert's guidance, a constitutional monarch, consulted by premiers like Peel, Palmerston, and Disraeli. Her confidence grew. She demanded information, questioned policies, and learned to balance her powers over Parliament with the needs of her subjects. The Great Exhibition of 1851, the dazzling brainchild of Prince Albert, became the triumph of the age, the shop window of the world. The Crystal Palace, built in Hyde Park, showcased British industry, ingenuity, and empire. Victoria presided with pride, her family at her side, writing later that she felt more proud and happy than I can express. The world's eyes turned to Britain, and for a moment Victoria's vision seemed unassailable. Yet even at the pinnacle of her power, shadows lengthened. Albert's health began to falter under the relentless pressures of public duty and private grief. Tensions with Palmerston, with his reckless foreign policy and secretive intrigues, led to political crisis after crisis. Irish disputes, Indian mutinies, and the Crimean War gnawed at the nation's confidence. Amidst these storms, Victoria's sense of duty, instilled in her since childhood, became her armor. Chapter 6. The Longest Grief. If the first half of Victoria's life was defined by love's arrival, the second half would be defined by its loss. In 1861, as winter fell, Prince Albert succumbed to typhoid fever at Windsor Castle. Victoria, overwhelmed by guilt, her own constant worry that the strains of royal duty had hastened his decline, was inconsolable. "There is no one to call me Victoria now," she wrote, her diary trembling with grief. She retreated from court life, plunging the monarchy into black crape and silence. For a time, even her resonant presence seemed lost to the nation. Rumors multiplied. The press dubbed her the Widow of Windsor. Critics accused her of abandoning her people. Political chaos, the rise of Republican ideals, Irish violence, and the revolt of India tested the monarchy's very survival. Through it all, she clung to her correspondence with ministers and to a small circle of confidants. One figure drew more attention and controversy than any other: John Brown, her Scottish servant, blunt, fiercely loyal, and utterly devoted. Whether their relationship was platonic or otherwise remains the subject of endless debate. But there is no doubt that he helped lift her from the depths, giving her the strength to surface once more. If the taste of loss once threatened to drown Victoria. The iron of her character would not yield. In widowhood, she brooded, sometimes self-destructive, but her penchant for duty never gave way to despair outright. By 1862, her figure in perpetual mourning had become a symbol, a nation in miniature mourning for the passing of an age, even as Victoria herself hovered at its center, refusing to abdicate the burdens of sovereignty. Chapter 7. The Queen in Black. Victoria's long seclusion became legend. For years, she appeared in public only fleetingly, her black attire and white widow's cap instantly recognizable. She wrote tirelessly to her beloved eldest daughter, Vicky, now Crown Princess of Prussia, to her ministers, and most intimately to John Brown, the Highland servant, whose brusque loyalty became both shield and scandal. Yet, as the 1860s ground on, the British Empire, its reach unfurling across Africa and Asia, could not wait for grief's indulgence. Parliament clamored for the monarch's return. Disraeli and Gladstone, the twin giants of Victorian statesmanship, vied for her favor and attention. With cautious steps, and at the urging of both her children and her people, she began to resume her public role, presiding once again over the great machinery of monarchy and empire. Her kingdom needed her presence. Irish unrest simmered and burst forth in the Fenian Rising. The American Civil War sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In India, the wounds of mutiny were raw. If Victoria could not rule with the raw charisma of her consort, she would rule by example, staid, steady, immovable as granite. But beneath the veil of mourning, Victoria's emotional life remained vivid. Her heart, shackled by expectation, could not quite banish affection. She relied increasingly on Brown, to whom she wrote, "You are indeed the only support and comfort I have now." Gossip newspapers snickered with talk of Mrs. Brown, but Victoria cared little for such insults. Through their almost daily walks at Balmoral and Osborne, she rediscovered in the Scottish hills temporary relief from her relentless royal routine. Chapter 8. Mother of Empires. Family, the other perpetual storm in Victoria's life, became both anchor and arena. Her 9 children, scattered across Europe through marriage and relationship, tied the British throne to the fates of Prussia, Russia, Denmark, and Spain. Each alliance was a move on the grand chessboard of continental power. Each wedding, a test of both diplomacy and maternal love. She both longed for and resisted their independence. When her eldest, Vicky, gave birth to a boy, future Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria doted upon her German grandson, while fretting over the growing nationalist ambitions that tugged at Prussian politics. Her other daughters, Alice, Helena, Louise, and Beatrice, likewise found themselves at the crossroads of duty and affection, married into both fortune and misfortune. Her eldest son, Bertie, later King Edward VII, remained a source of repeated anxiety. Charming, reckless, always courting scandal, he clashed repeatedly with his mother over the demands of court and the shape of the future. Their letters, sometimes affectionate, often scolding, reveal the lifelong tension between personal disappointment and public necessity. England itself was in flux. The Second Reform Act of 1867 expanded the vote, and the urban working class started to find its political voice. Indian subjects came under the direct rule of the Crown after the failure of the East India Company. The monarchy, once insular and German-linked, now needed to be genuinely British, even imperial. It was Disraeli, with his unique mixture of flattery and vision, who would persuade Victoria to embrace the new British identity. In 1876, he engineered her elevation as Empress of India, a title both symbolic and concrete, a recognition of the monarchy's rule over millions. Disraeli's gesture spoke to Victoria's pride and her lingering wounds. In her 60-year reign, she had become not just Queen of the United Kingdom, but a living emblem of empire. "It is," she confessed in her diary, "a pride, but a heavy, heavy burden." Chapter 9. Power, Policy, and Paradox. Victoria aged, but she did not wither. Her reign encompassed revolutions in rail and telegraph, electricity and sanitation. She attended the opening of the Thames Embankment and the first underground railway. She corresponded with Florence Nightingale about hospital reform, and, despite her distaste for the dear people's open demands, she slowly understood that the monarchy must adapt to survive. Her relationships with her prime ministers were legendary. Gladstone, earnest, evangelical, insatiably verbose, she sometimes called that half-madman. Disraeli, ever the master of charm, secured her adoration with gallant letters and deferential wit. "We are amused," she declared after one especially clever Disraeli turn of phrase, a pointed echo of a French Sun King, perhaps, but with peculiar British restraint. Both men, in their way, shaped the Victorian monarchy. Gladstone pressed her for reforms. Disraeli crafted her an imperial crown. Victoria knew how to wield her influence, dismissing ministers at will, her notes and secret missives forming a hidden government within the government. She never forgot the lessons learned at Lord Melbourne's knee, that true royal power was wielded subtly, invisibly, with a gloved hand. Wider upheavals demanded her presence. The Crimean War, fought at terrible cost between 1853 and 1856, had drawn Victoria into direct correspondence with her generals, and she sent knitted scarves to the front lines. Her family, like so many others, was not immune to tragedy. Her daughter Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse, died in 1878 of diphtheria, the same disease that claimed her daughter's child. With each loss, Victoria's public gravitas seemed to deepen, her private sadness only masked by the rigid forms of royal protocol. Chapter 10. Windsor and Empire. As Victoria's reign entered its final decades, technological and cultural revolutions exploded all around her. The telegraph had connected her to India, Canada, Australia. Her message for her Golden Jubilee in 1887 was sent around the world at the speed of thought itself. London's streets became ever more crowded. The Irish Home Rule debate threatened schism. Social progress, votes for women, the growth of labor unions, education for all, became movements that no monarchy could ignore. Through it all, Victoria's small, imperious figure became iconic. Her image, reproduced on coins and postage, on statues and in newspapers, was known from South Africa to Singapore, from the frozen wilds of Canada to the teeming streets of Calcutta. For many of her colonial subjects, she was a distant and mythic symbol, a great white queen whose compassion was both real and instrumental in maintaining an empire that was, in places, ruled as much by spectacle as by law. Yet, in her correspondence, Victoria was anything but remote. She wept at stories of famine. She comforted bereaved widows. Her household, though obsessed with protocol, was often marked by moments of affection, confusion, and comic misunderstanding. Her wit, sharp and practical, punctured the pomposity of her courtiers. "We are not amused," she was once incorrectly reported to mutter at a bawdy story. In truth, she enjoyed a hearty laugh when the occasion truly warranted. Her relationship with her Indian attendant, Abdul Karim, added an unexpected epilogue to her emotional life. Appointed as her munshi, teacher, in 1887, Karim taught her Urdu and offered her glimpses of the subcontinent she would rule, but never visit. Despite the scorn and suspicion of her household, Victoria grew remarkably close to Karim, even as aging and failing health began to slow her indomitable stride. Chapter 11. The Shadow of the Century's End. By her 80th year, Victoria was the surviving matriarch of a Europe once united by family, but now riven by rivalry and nearing the precipice of war. The children she had raised to be diplomats and peacemakers were now kings, queens, and kaisers, often antagonists, sometimes outright enemies. Her grandson, Wilhelm II of Germany, had become an increasingly erratic and aggressive force, threatening Europe's fragile peace. Victoria wrote to him, sometimes gently, sometimes sternly, but even she could not control the tides of modern politics. The new century loomed, with its telephones and motor cars, its demands for change and its rumblings of unrest. Victoria's physical presence, once so striking, now wizened and altogether frailer, remained magnetic. In her final years, she stood as a living link to a vanished age, one who had met Napoleon's captors, corresponded with Abraham Lincoln, personally survived courtly rebellion and assassination attempts, and borne witness to a world transformed by industry, war, and science. In December 1900, Victoria traveled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The journey from Windsor, made with an entourage now more for reassurance than for spectacle, proved exhausting. She kept her routine as long as she could, dictating letters, attending to matters of state, reading dispatches, insisting upon even the smallest details, until the 19th of January, when a weakening body compelled her to retire. Her children gathered: Bertie, the Prince of Wales, her daughters Beatrice and Louise, and the extended grandchildren, European royalty waiting in the wings, uncertain and anxious. Victoria's mind, sharp even in decline, drifted between lucidity and the half-dreams of a near century lived in the public gaze. On January 22, 1901, as dusk gathered in the drawing room at Osborne, Victoria drew her last breath. The Queen Empress, whose name became the very age she had ruled, was gone at last. Her reign had lasted 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, the longest the British Isles had ever known. London's bells tolled their heavy requiem. Across continents, the news traveled by cable and rider and runner, from gold rush outposts in Canada to tea gardens in Ceylon. The world paused, as if stunned, in the shadow of her departing spirit. Part 3. The Aftermath, Legacy, and the Age She Made. The passing of Queen Victoria marked the twilight of an era unlike any before in British history. Her body, shrouded in white, eschewing the black garb she had worn through so many decades of loss, lay in Osborne House, surrounded by flowers sent from every corner of her vast empire. The queen who had been born into obscurity died the most recognized woman in the world, and the empire she left behind trembled on the cusp of an uncertain future. Chapter 12. The Mourning of Empires. As the news spread through England, a palpable hush fell upon London's busiest streets. Shopkeepers pulled down their blinds, churches filled with silent, grieving congregations. All of England's social classes, from the richest industrialist to the humblest chimney sweep, seemed united in reflexive sadness for the loss of their grandmother of Europe. Victoria's instructions for her funeral were precise. She wanted neither black drapery nor overt displays of sorrow. Instead, she insisted upon white horses and white pall. Among the mementos placed in her coffin were tokens of a life marked by profound personal attachments: a lock of Albert's hair, a photograph of John Brown, and the wedding ring of her devoted Highland servant. Her funeral cortege, stretching from Osborne to Windsor, became a spectacle that delicately balanced tradition, emotion, and the unyielding passage of time. Royalty from nearly every reigning house of Europe attended. Her children and grandchildren in mourning dress, their faces etched with both grief and the knowledge that the long shadow of Victoria would shape their fates. At St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the future King Edward VII, her eldest son, long kept at the periphery of real power, stood at the head of her coffin. Sobs from the crowd broke the respectful silence. With her interment, the Second Elizabethan Age, as some would call it, had truly begun, an age of automobiles, electricity, suffrage, and the painful waning of empires. Chapter 13. The Crown Passed On. For Edward, the path was not easy. The new king had spent a lifetime as heir apparent, chafing under a mother's scrutiny and the weight of inherited expectation. Now he bore the crown, but in an England transformed. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, quickly rebranded by war and changing mood, would struggle with a modernity that had only begun to dawn during Victoria's rule. Her grandchildren, Wilhelm II in Germany, Alexandra in Russia, would soon be swept into the crucible of the First World War. The family of nations, Victoria, so carefully crafted, became a web of tragedy and conflict unheard of in her day. Victoria's own children remembered her not only as monarch, but as a mother, loving, stern, forever concerned with their schooling, marriages, and morals. The letters she had written, numbering in the thousands, testified to a woman capable of both great passion and iron discipline, a ruler who believed that private affection could be harmonized, even with the public's relentless scrutiny. Chapter 14. The Queen and Her Legacy. Beneath the pageantry, Victoria's legacy was of a more profound sort. She had in many ways invented the modern monarchy, where her forebears had been involved in partisan machinations or disreputable scandal. Victoria's life was deliberately visible, steeped in a sense of duty and respectability. Her family became the living embodiment of national ideals: stability, morality, hard work, and Christian virtue. As the Industrial Revolution completely transformed Britain, Victoria mastered the art of thoughtful adaptation. She welcomed, then championed, advances in communication and travel. It was under her that the first telegrams flashed between empires and the first trains carried her across England. She embraced the idea of the royal walkabout, connecting directly with her subjects, and she guided the monarchy to a constitutional model that forswore political power in favor of symbolic, uniting influence. Her favorite places, Osborne, Balmoral, Windsor, became legendary, set pieces for the pageantry and private moments of royal life alike. Her support for the National Gallery, the Great Exhibition, and the expansion of the British Museum codified the relationship between the monarchy, knowledge, and the creative flowering of the age. In public memory, Victoria was both Britannia herself, a figure comforting, steadfast, and distinctly British, and a deeply complex woman, riven with grief, passion, stubbornness, and an abiding love of family. Her diaries, eventually edited and published in part, revealed a monarch conscious always of her station, yet brimming with the humor and anxieties of the everyday. Chapter 15. The Shadow and the Sun. The historian Winston Churchill, born during her reign, famously declared that Queen Victoria's influence was felt in every continent and in every creed. And yet, it was during the years shortly after her death that the world would realize just how much she had kept Britain's contradictions in uneasy balance. The British Empire, at its zenith upon her death, soon faced its limits. The Boer War in South Africa concluded just months after Victoria's funeral, a prelude to imperial crises to come. Ireland's struggle for home rule intensified. In India, where her image had once adorned processions, new movements for independence gathered energy, inspired in part by the ambiguous legacy of a queen who called herself Empress, but never set foot on the soil she ruled. At home, the Edwardian age blossomed, a period of remarkable grace, invention, and style, but also one of mounting political unrest and change. Suffragettes battered at the gates of Parliament, demanding the vote for women, causes Victoria herself had opposed, even as her reign proved the possibilities of female sovereignty. Trade unions, socialist societies, and reformers grew more insistent, reshaping the monarchy's relationship with the people. Yet even as the world changed, Victoria's memory loomed. Statues rose across the empire. Her birthday became a holiday in far-off Canada. Cities in Australia and Africa bore her name. In the great domes of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the railway stations and red postboxes, in the laws and traditions she forged, one could sense a presence, at once imperial and domestic, indomitable and compassionate. Chapter 16. Epilogue. The Measure of a Monarch. Now, more than a century since her passing, historians debate the footprints of her age. Was Victoria merely an emblem, her real power limited by Parliament and the ambitions of greater men? Or was she the keystone, her will, patience, and devotion holding together a civil society through decades of dynamic, sometimes tumultuous change? Biographies, scholarly works, and popular novels paint her now as a tragic heroine, now as an unbending matriarch, but always as a touchstone for what it meant to lead in a changing world. Queen Victoria's story is not just a catalogue of events, but a meeting point of moments and meanings, a life lived at the intersection of monarchy, womanhood, and the relentless march of history. Her shadows, her losses and doubts define her as much as her shining moments of triumph. Her devotion to Albert, her nurturing and sometimes smothering love for her children, her cautious experiments with new political forms and technologies, all are part of a vast, intricate mosaic. The queen who was born in a palace clouded by the scandals and failures of her uncles died a symbol of unity, her empire stretching across a quarter of the globe, her people more diverse and dynamic than any in history. She weathered upheaval, assassination attempts, family quarrels, the madness of wars, and the tumult of industrial revolution. And always, even in old age, she wrote, her diaries a whisper across the years, binding together the private love and the public service, at the heart of the Victorian story. Great events make me quiet and calm. It is only trifles that irritate my nerves. So ended her time, but the world she shaped moved forward still, trembling on the edge of a new century, industrial, interconnected, turbulent, and forever stamped with the memory of a little queen whose courage and contradictions gave a name to an age. Part 4. Ripples through time and the world. She left behind. The era after Victoria's death was, in many senses, the world's reckoning with the change she wrought. The sun had not yet set on the empire, but there were red clouds on the horizon. A sense not merely in London, but in Delhi and Sydney, in Ottawa and Cape Town, that the old assurances were gone. The fabric of monarchy and empire would be tested in ways Victoria herself could scarcely have imagined. Chapter 17. The Tides of History. The immediate years after her passing were suffused with nostalgia and unease. The Edwardian glitter, pomp and pageantry, the Art Nouveau curves of a new age, masked a society tormented by restlessness. The aristocracy clung to tradition, but below, the foundations were shifting. Victoria's son, King Edward VII, strove to maintain the respect, grandeur, and popularity that had come to be linked to the throne under his mother. In some ways, he succeeded. He was genial, unpretentious, and well-liked. Yet he, like so many of Europe's monarchs, Victoria's grandsons and granddaughters, would face storms soon enough. Victoria's family tree, sprawling and complex, was the blueprint for the alliances and conflicts to come. Her daughter Vicky's son, Wilhelm II, ruled Germany, at odds with his cousins in Britain and Russia. Alexandra, Tsarina of Russia and Victoria's granddaughter, would meet her tragic end in the Russian Revolution. Proof that the bonds Victoria had so optimistically fostered could not overcome the larger tectonics of politics and ideology. Across Europe's capitals, the little queen's progeny shaped and sometimes shattered the old order. The Great War, World War I, would see the royal houses, Victoria's children and grandchildren, swept away or transformed as ancient certainties dissolved in the crucible of modernity. Chapter 18. Memory's Kingdom. In her absence, Victoria was mythologized and reinterpreted. Historians and novelists alike recast her as both the stalwart mother of empire and a lonely widow presiding over the slow, sorrowful decline of her family's relevance. In statuary, painting, and popular celebration, she remained steadfast, matronly, wise, a fixed point amid the chaos of history. Yet, the other Victoria emerged, the passionate young queen, emotional, quick to tears and laughter, who wrote thousands of words each week and poured out her anxieties, hopes, and irritations onto notepaper and in meticulous journals. The queen who rebuked her ministers, doted on her dogs, and found first love in awkward, blushing meetings with Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. A prince who would, through both intellect and affection, shape her approach to power. The diaries Victoria left, carefully preserved and later edited by her youngest daughter Beatrice, and a select coterie of confidential advisors, have become an indispensable resource to every scholar of the Victorian age. They reveal a woman acutely aware of her symbolic function and at times quietly subversive. Her legacy is thus one not merely of marble and silver, but of a lived humanity that resonates centuries later. Chapter 19. Foundations of the Modern Monarchy. If Victoria's reign was marked by continuity and tradition, it was equally remarkable for its subtle, enduring revolutions. The British monarchy that entered the 20th century was not what she had inherited. Aloof, embroiled in politics, and often a target for ridicule. Instead, it was stable, reclusive, but visible, a pillar of social and moral respectability. Victoria's example of constitutional monarchy, her determination to operate through dialogue rather than edict, to maintain a dignified reserve from political tumult while exerting gentle influence in private, set the template for her successors. The pageantry of royal jubilees and weddings, the quiet but potent symbolism of state openings of Parliament and royal Christmas messages, all took root under the soil she cultivated. She was also a monarch of the domestic. Her model of family life, with its holidays at Balmoral and Osborne, its rituals and affections, tempered though they were by duty, gave her subjects something aspirational and accessible. If she was, at times, made into a symbol of prudery and repression, it was because her reign stood in deliberate contrast with the chaos and excesses of the Regency and early Hanoverians. Chapter 20. Empire, Loss, and Enduring Question. Victoria's imperial role is perhaps her most complicated inheritance. To millions, she was never more than a face on a coin or a statue in a distant colonial city. She was sometimes seen as the paragon of benevolent rule, at others as the distant, indifferent symbol of foreign domination. In India, the proclamation of 1877 had crowned her empress, her image distributed in photographs and prints that became icons of British power. Yet, as independence movements stirred, often led by Indians who were educated in the English language and values Victoria herself extolled, the contradiction at the heart of her title became clear. The moral confidence that had driven so much expansion during her life began to waver as her sons and grandsons attempted to hold together the world she left behind. The scramble for Africa, prosecuted with both idealism and brutality, would bring about legacies, both positive and painful, that the world still reckons with. Victoria was sometimes invoked as a guiding star for Christian missionaries, reformers, and would-be architects of a more just world. At other times, as justification for the extension of a system that subjugated entire peoples. Her death did not resolve those questions. It only gave her legacy a mythic dimension, a symbol for every side of the arguments about empire, civilization, exploitation, and resistance. Chapter 21. The Long Victorian Afternoon. Even in the decades after her passing, the habits Victoria established, a respect for duty, a model of constitutionalism, a tentative embrace of popular sentiment, still provided the monarchy with a fragile but powerful legitimacy. The Victorian age remained an object of fascination and nostalgia in literature, music, and art, as well as in the collective memory of the British people. Victorian values, order, industriousness, self-control, continued to influence education and culture, shaping the character of nations that would, after the devastations of global war, look to the past for compass and comfort. And from Rudyard Kipling's imperial poetry to Virginia Woolf's nuanced, sometimes critical portraits of the age, Victoria's long shadow fell over every evocation of British identity, progress, and loss. Her life, so vividly chronicled, served as both romantic inspiration and, to modern minds, as a prompt for deeper, sometimes uncomfortable, reevaluation. Chapter 22. Victoria's Words, Victoria's World. In the end, it is perhaps Victoria's own words that best sum up her reign. Words written by a hand, sometimes hesitant, sometimes forceful, always conscious of their endurance beyond her own time. We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist. In those words, and in so many others, lies both the promise and the peril of the Victorian idea. England, and by extension the Empire, transformed itself under her guidance, at once resisting and embracing change. Her voice echoes still, not just in the marble likenesses that adorn town squares and government buildings, but in the hearts of monarchs and citizens who grapple with what it means to lead, to change, and to persevere through uncertainty. In those echoes, the little princess born at Kensington, the widow of Windsor, and the Empress of India remains a living presence. Her life was the story of an age, the story finally of an ordinary woman who bore extraordinary burdens, and who, by the sheer weight of her personality and tenacity, left the world irreversibly changed. Part 5. Queen. Forever. Remembered, reimagined, and the enduring presence. The 20th century advanced in waves of invention, war, liberation, and sorrow. Through all this, the paradox of Queen Victoria remained. At once a fixed image of time-worn authority, and a figure with an ever-changing meaning. Monuments to her still stood on every continent, often weathered by storm and struggle, speaking to a world that had grown older, but perhaps not, in every way, wiser. Chapter 23. The Living Legacy. In 1911, just a decade after Victoria's death, the crowning of George V, her grandson, confirmed that the house she'd stabilized would endure into the troubled era of world wars and revolutions. The empire's dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, participated in her memory, their legislation still wrapped in the language of the Victorian law. The streets she'd walked were now lit by electric lamps, the parks she'd cherished filled with memorials, with little children in starched collars looking up at the stone semblance of their old queen. The world her reign had shaped was changing by the hour. The suffrage movement, dismissed by Victoria as mad, wicked folly, triumphed as women entered Parliament and the professions. The war she had not lived to see, but which her family's rivalries had in part sown, the First World War, shattered the certainties of her empire, even as her grandsons led armies against each other under different banners. In India, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi began the experiment in civil disobedience, which would, decades later, free the subcontinent from the very empire that had crowned Victoria Empress. Statues of her, revered and resented alike, looked down on processions not of royal splendor, but of protest and transformation. Chapter 24. Within the family's heart. For the royal family, Victoria's presence did not fade. Her meticulous records, her letters in flowing hand, became the archives that later sovereigns studied when crisis came. King George V consulted her notes when the monarchy faltered after World War I. Queen Mary, her granddaughter-in-law, read Victoria's diaries for courage as London's bombs fell in the Blitz. The succession continued, now through female reign again, twice more. George VI's daughter Elizabeth, to become queen in her own right, cherished the precedent of a female monarch thriving in a man's world. Princesses across Europe were schooled in Victorian virtues, though much changed: discretion, piety, a sense of noblesse oblige, and, above all, endurance in the face of loss as well as triumph. Family gatherings, once the scene of political negotiation and dynastic planning, became quieter things. Balmoral, Windsor, and Osborne House lived on as cherished retreats, breathing history. In the saloons, children still played and laughed. In the libraries, the sound of a careful pen over blank paper echoed down generations. Chapter 25. The World Remembers. The centenary of Victoria's death in 2001 was marked by a reappraisal as searching as any the monarchy has undergone. Historians, writers, and filmmakers reclaimed her not only as a monument, but as a human being, sometimes shy, sometimes stormy, and most often passionately, anxiously alive to the responsibilities she bore. Novels and films imagined the secret life of the Widow of Windsor, her obsessions with John Brown or Abdul Karim, her conflicted feelings over empire and her own family. Feminists reclaimed the young Victoria's pluck and intelligence, even as they mourned her later opposition to political rights for women. The empire's heirs reassessed her role. Was she a benevolent mother of nations, or an icon of toxic domination? The answer seemed increasingly to depend on where one stood. Yet everywhere the evidence of her age was inescapable. In the arches of modern railway stations, in the civil service traditions of a score of nations, in the language of law, church, and daily life, and in the faces of her sprawling, now global family. Chapter 26, The Final Shadows and Sunrises. Each new generation finds its own Victoria. To some, she's a stately, silent grandmother whose frown curbs excess and demands respect. To others, she is the spirited young queen with an unshakable sense of destiny, learning and stumbling, loving and losing, forging a new path against the odds. She is the queen who wrote poetry, adored Mendelssohn's music, and sketched her forests at Balmoral in the mist. She is the empress whose word could unlock new laws or crush old customs, whose touch made the monarchy untouchable in some ways and deeply vulnerable in others. So often history shrouds great women in myth. Victoria's myth is that of duty, grandeur, and mourning, but also of laughter, frustration, stubborn love, and triumph. Her voice both distant and unexpectedly near. Finale, Victoria's enduring song. And so, from that first dawn in Kensington to her twilight end at Osborne, Victoria's reign was, and remains, one of paradox and power, of loss and renewal. The world remade itself in her time and in her image. Not always willingly, but inevitably. Her empire is gone, the old certainties displaced. But the memory of that short, stout, imperious woman, who ruled not only with iron will but with every frailty of feeling, remains. To this day, tourists visit her palaces. Scholars sift her letters. Children in far-off lands play in Queen Victoria Gardens. And every so often, in the swirl of politics or parade, someone bows their head, remembering that once, in the heart of an empire, a little girl grew to queenly stature, shaped the fate of millions, and gave her name not only to a people, but to an epoch. In the quiet lines of her final diary, as night falls on the 19th century, she writes, "All has passed so quickly, years heavy with joy and so terribly full of sorrow. But the Lord has blessed, and I have done my best." Her candle flickers out, but her world, restless and unstill, moves ever forward, still, and perhaps always, in the shadow and the light of Victoria. Part 6. Threads of Continuity, Victoria's Spirit in a Modern World. Chapter 27. The Empire in Twilight. Across the first decades of the 20th century, the empire Victoria had helped forge persisted as both beacon and burden. In Australia, schoolchildren recited, "God Save the Queen," their classrooms adorned with her stern, kindly image. In India and Africa, coins bearing her profile continued to pass from hand to hand, reminders of a distant, sovereign ancestor. Yet her world was transforming quickly. The Great War left wounds no coronation or ceremony could heal. Millions of young men marched under regimental colors, bearing Victoria's battle honors, crossing battlefields their grandmothers had only read about. A war more vast and terrible than anything foreseen during the anxieties of her later years. As the old alliances ripped apart, people invoked her name as a symbol of unity. even as the lived reality of her reign blended into the sepia tones of nostalgia. Her moral code, forged in the crucible of duty and personal loss, subtly shaped the expectations of leaders and citizens alike. Prime ministers invoked Victorian values as shorthand for thrift, integrity, and industriousness. Ideals summoned as the world tried to rebuild from ashes, trying to believe again in the possibility of order after chaos. Chapter 28. Shifting Sands, Shifting Thrones. Victoria's family, scattered like seeds across Europe's royal houses, faced the storm of revolution and war. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, her granddaughter and namesake, perished with their children in the brutal end of the Russian monarchy. In Germany, Wilhelm II, once her beloved Willie, was forced to abdicate, exiled, and embittered. The imperial throne lost forever. Yet in Britain, the monarchy survived, guided by the lessons Victoria had hammered into her children, and by extension the public. Restraint, adaptability, and a certain quiet, symbolic presence above the world of politics and protest. King George V, though far from his grandmother's personal style, embodied this to the surprise of many. The monarchy became more accessible, more circumspect, comfort to a grieving nation. During the Blitz of World War II, as bombs fell over London, Victoria's granddaughter-in-law, Queen Mary, recalled the fortitude of Windsor under Victoria. And Queen Elizabeth, her great-great-granddaughter, exemplified the keep calm and carry on spirit that so many imputed to the Victorians. Chapter 29. The Commoner's Queen. Victoria's era had once set the tone for social hierarchy, yet her own trajectory trended steadily toward connection with ordinary Britons, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes with ceremony. The royal walkabout, which became tradition in the 20th and 21st centuries, was rooted in Victoria's willingness to visit hospitals, schools, and slums, to face not only the pageantry, but also the people behind the scenes. Veterans recalled her visits to the wounded after the Crimean War. Their descendants honored her by supporting charities she'd founded. The Victoria Cross, established in 1856 at her will, remained the highest award for gallantry, linking generations through acts of courage unimagined on the steps of Kensington Palace. Social changes she could not foresee. Labor rights, the National Health Service, universal education, grew on the grounds prepared by campaigns for reform and scientific progress that she herself, with Albert, had sponsored or endorsed. In this, the lines between queen and subject subtly blurred, as millions found ways to see themselves, however faintly, reflected in her life. Chapter 30. The Victorian Mirror in Contemporary Life. Florists in London's markets still keep vases marked with a V for Victoria, as if a piece of her spirit lingers in every English bloom. In the great museums, the art, science, and natural curiosities amassed during her reign inspire generations with both pride and unease. Pride at achievement, unease at the imperial project that sometimes lay beneath. Writers, too, returned ceaselessly to her time, seeing the Victorian era as both cradle and crucible for the world's current complexities. Dickens and Eliot, Hardy and the Brontes, her literary contemporaries, continued to populate the collective imagination with the dreams and despairs of her subjects. New novelists and filmmakers retold her story, sometimes in adoration, sometimes in critique, but always with fascination. For the millions of immigrants to Britain from former colonies, the memory of Victoria is refracted through family stories and inherited pain, but also through pride in survival and resilience. For LGBTQ+ Britons, the legal reforms denied in Victoria's day gave way, over the decades, to new forms of justice and celebration, a marker of just how far the world has moved from the unspoken silences of her court. Chapter 31. On the Shoulders of a Queen. Historians continue to debate. Was her greatest achievement constitutional restraint or popular spectacle? Was her power real or symbolic, her authority personal, or only that of a shrewd survivor in a world of men? Most find the truth somewhere in between. What is certain is the centrality of her example, her mistakes, as much as her accomplishments. Monarchs now rule, if one can call it rule, with less power but perhaps more subtle influence, in the manner Victoria honed over decades of diaries, dinners, and careful interventions. Students of government, gender, and empire see in her a paradox. A woman who wielded immense informal power, but doubted the worth of movements for women's rights. An imperial sovereign whose reign advanced both education and conquest, philanthropy and force. She is honored, sometimes awkwardly, in legacies of charity, of learning, of systems that celebrate progress and face relentless scrutiny. The Victorian era, as lived and as mythologized, is the testing ground for all the paradoxes of modernity. Chapter 32. A Living Presence. On certain London mornings, as the fog creeps low over the gates of Buckingham Palace, people still look for an echo, a glimmer, of the little queen who once gazed from those windows. To the outsider, it is only stone, glass, and memory. To those steeped in her history, it is more a sense of continuity, of a story that began in the quiet rooms of Kensington and swept the world, shaping destinies from coal miners to kings, teachers to cabinet ministers. On the Isle of Wight, Osborne House is a museum, but in its nurseries and gardens, the shadow of Victoria's family laughter still drifts on the salty breeze, and tourists walk the forest paths where she once sketched her children, grieving and grateful, solitary, yet surrounded by the living pulse of the world she ruled. Part 7. Echoes Without End. Victoria and the Endless Tomorrow. Chapter 33. Across Oceans and Generations. Even as the British Empire fragmented, the shadow of Victoria reached into every former colony. In Canada, in parks and upon grand avenues, statues of the Queen still stand. The annual celebration of Victoria Day signals not simply the coming of summer, but the confused, proud, and sometimes awkward inheritance of a colonial past. For many Canadians, she remains both a remote sovereign and an unexpectedly familiar face. Grandmotherly, yet formidable. In Australia and New Zealand, the same duality persists. Queen Victoria's profile remains on coins and monuments, but her legacy is the subject of heated debate. Some see her as a benevolent empress who presided over advances in self-government and science, while indigenous voices remind the world that Victorian expansion wrought destruction and dispossession. Debates over statues and place names reveal the evolving relationship between nations and the icon whose reign marked their history's turning points. In Africa, the contrasts are starker still. There, for many, Victoria's memory recalls not freedom, but the heavy yoke of colonial conquest. Yet she is not universally reviled. In post-colonial Kenya and Uganda, her name and image sometimes endure in markets and churches, curios and legends, as touchstones of a time whose legacy is both wound and thread for future generations. Chapter 34. the queen in the modern mind. The process of reinterpreting Victoria never ceases, for her reign is the palimpsest upon which new generations inscribe their worries and dreams. She is the loving widow, privately devastated and publicly indomitable, chosen by television dramas and new biographies as prime material for reflection on grief, duty, and contradiction. In an age obsessed with celebrity, her dual life, on display and intensely private, has become paradoxically more relevant than ever. Feminist scholars return to Victoria's story not just for her opposition to women's suffrage, but for the extraordinary exercise of soft power she modeled, navigating treacherous waters between ministers, nations, and her own inner circle. LGBTQ+ perspectives draw out stories drowned in subtext, the powerful, ambiguous companionships she cultivated, the emotional intensity that animated her relationships with both men and women. Thus, she has become a figure through which people explore patterns of strength, oppression, identity, and adaptation. The Victorian in literature and speech is now both a compliment and a curse, a shortcut to steadiness, prudery, hypocrisy, inventiveness, and bold transformation. When a city's architecture evokes order and confidence, it is Victorian. When a law is stern, a parent overbearing, an attitude out of step with change, it is also Victorian. Yet for every cliché, there is an undercurrent of fascination, a recognition that under Victoria's gaze, the world reordered itself, and that in every order there is sowing and reaping, preservation and revolt. To Chapter 35, Legacy Carried Forward. In 2012, as the world watched Queen Elizabeth II, Victoria's great-great-granddaughter, celebrate her Diamond Jubilee, many reflected on the uncanny resonance between the two queens. Elizabeth, facing her own challenges in a time of doubt and change, invoked Victoria's faith in tradition and gentle innovation. Children waved Union flags, just as they did for Victoria in the blitz of her golden and diamond jubilees. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, now a living symbol of continuity, even as the modern world swelled around it. The resemblances, physical and temperamental, were commented upon. Both women small in stature, commanding in will, reserved in manner, capable in crisis, acutely aware of the burdens and extraordinary privileges of royalty. The monarchy today, with its blend of pageantry and ordinariness, owes much to Victoria's choices. The tension between publicity and reserve, modernity and ceremony. When a royal wedding is broadcast worldwide, when the Queen or King speaks at Christmas, when palaces open their doors to charity and art, there is an unbroken line back to the careful, calculated acts of the Empress of India. Chapter 36, The Enduring Personal Queen. The great paradox of monarchy is that its power lies not only in public grandeur, but in private resonance. Victoria's letters, journals, and personal artifacts have become talismans for those seeking connection across time. An amateur genealogist might discover a servant ancestor who worked at Windsor during Victoria's reign. A distant cousin in Canada finds pride in a long-ago knighthood. For many, these small claims are as meaningful as the grand victories and treaties. Museums in London, Melbourne, Calcutta, and Toronto display Victoria's dresses, inkstands, the endless flow of correspondence, and mementos of her prolific life. Each item is both relic and storytelling device, drawing the gaze inward to the personality behind the persona. Visitors, young and old, trace the handwriting on a birthday note or marvel at her tiny, neat shoes. and feel the years collapse into an intimate present. The Queen's own image became currency, not only on the coins minted in her name, but in the imagination. Artists, illustrators, satirists, playwrights, and later television directors and costume designers have all shaped her myth anew, each finding in her life a mirror of their desires and anxieties. Chapter 37. Memory and Mystery. There is, finally, much that will never be known. Whole chapters of Victoria's passionate inner life were edited away by her daughter Beatrice, or were simply never recorded. Rumors and secrets swirl. What was her true relationship with John Brown, or with Abdul Karim? To what extent did she understand, or try to understand, the suffering behind the imperial glory her reign commemorated each year? How did she reconcile her deep Christian convictions with policies that, while well-meant, so often perpetuated inequality or harm? The best historians admit mystery. Victorian England was a land of shadows as well as light, of Dickensian squalor and soaring industry, repression and revolution. Victoria, the woman and the Queen, embodied those contradictions. Her era's unfinished business, questions of justice, freedom, identity, and the meaning of home, remains our own. In every age, her legend becomes not smaller, but larger, as the world looks back, searching in her story for patterns that explain, justify, or warn. Chapter 38. Forever Victoria. On certain anniversaries, cannon fire echoes down the Thames, church bells toll across shires and cities, and people read again the words Victoria left behind. Her diaries, published now in volumes and online, draw new admirers at every century's turn. Just a girl, just a woman, just a queen, wrote one poet, reflecting on her passage through grief and glory. In the candlelit silence of her final night at Osborne House, she set down her pen for the last time, and the world she helped to form prepared for whatever dawn would come. And still, through war and memory, tradition and change, argument and affection, the age of Queen Victoria is with us yet. In the grandeur of great halls and the intimacy of private hearts, her shadow and her sun endure alike. Part 8, Endless Echoes, the Tapestry of Remembrance. Chapter 39, Artifacts and Afterlives. In the hushed galleries of London's museums and the sunlit parlor rooms of Osborne House, Victoria's world remains touchable, never fully receding into the mists of history. Each teacup, brooch, portrait, and diary page tells its own story, a fragment from which scholars, schoolchildren, and sightseers each try to piece together the character of the Queen and the epoch she shaped. The Victoria and Albert Museum stands as a testament not only to her love for Albert and their fascination with the arts, but also to the ambitions, some realized, others broken, of an age intoxicated by progress. Here, the grandeur of the age mingles solemnly with its silence. Some visitors see in every display a triumph of civilization. Others, a record of what colonization cost. Still others, simply the beautiful curiosities of lives lived before their own. Across Britain, place names and institutions speak her memory. Hospitals and bridges, parks, scholarships, and botanical gardens, you encounter her everywhere, in the names of ships and towns from Victoria Falls to Melbourne. None knows how many millions have spoken her name, whether in reverence, routine, or rebuke, and so her presence lingers, mundane and majestic. Chapter 40. The Rituals Continue. Every royal milestone retraces Victoria's footsteps. The Queen's birthday parade, trooping the color, recalls the displays she loved, cavalry glittering, flags unfurling, children pressed against railings for a glimpse of royalty. When the sovereign touches a sword to a soldier's shoulder, the echo reaches back through decades to Victoria's own hands, trembling in the first years of widowhood, steady again as she conferred medals on heroes. The rituals that surround royal births, weddings, and funerals persist, sometimes exactly as Victoria willed them, sometimes transformed to meet each new generation's needs. The world changes, yet the enduring pageantry connects past to present. Monarchs and people both look to tradition's comfort, even as they outgrow some of its forms, finding in the past both a mantle and a mirror. Chapter 41. Shadows in Literature and Film. Victorian fiction defined an age, and so did its queen. Novelists, her contemporaries and their descendants, never let her disappear. In Dickens' bustling, suffering London, she lives as backdrop. In Stevenson's Scotland, or in the haunted pages of the Bront. Sisters, one feels the atmosphere in which Victoria herself dreamed, mourned, and ruled. Modern storytellers have taken up the thread. In film and miniseries, she is sometimes a romantic, sometimes a tyrant, sometimes an old woman in black, sometimes again the young, girlish queen, eager and uncertain. Each retelling brings out a new aspect, her political acumen, her vulnerability, her jealousies and loyalties, her essential humanity. The Victorian age has become metaphor for comfort and constraint, for invention and inertia, for both Russia's foggy streets and India's searing plains. Through every tale, Victoria's shadow looms, sometimes benevolent, sometimes brooding, always inescapable. Chapter 42. The Global Commonwealth. Victoria's death did not end the idea of empire, nor its aftershocks. The British Commonwealth today is a loose federation of nations, many retaining the monarch as symbolic head of state. Others, like India, have forged their own destinies, yet still gather every so often under the shared legacy that began in earnest with Victoria. Into the 21st century, politicians, poets, and activists debate what, if anything, it means to belong to this vast, inherited family of nations. For some, her memory is a bond, a reminder of shared political heritage, law, and language. For others, it is a wound, a symbol of the suffering and struggle for independence that defined the 20th century. Each new statue contested, each name reconsidered, is a sign that her story is never truly finished, always being reimagined and reassessed. Chapter 43. Lessons and Warnings. Victoria's diaries speak often of God's providence, of her sense that every trial, from Albert's death to war abroad, from her children's sicknesses to the anxieties of aging, was part of some greater design. She clung to faith as both glue and compass. Yet the lessons history has drawn from her time are ambiguous, layered. We learn from her example that stability can be strength, but that change, even when resisted, is irresistible. We learn that empire's costs are felt in lives lost, cultures altered, destinies redirected, echoing from her reign into the most tangled debates of our own era. And we learn as well that even those set far above most of humanity by birth and circumstance are not spared grief, loneliness, error, or the ordinary hungers of the human heart. Chapter 44. The Heart Remembers. In letters and in legend, Victoria's personal attachments have become icons of their own. The story of young love, her hesitation and blush at proposing to Albert, her headstrong devotion to John Brown, her controversial, touchingly earnest admiration for Abdul Karim, reminds all who read her story that behind the crown beat a profoundly emotional, complicated heart. Millions who will never wear a crown find in her defeats and sorrows, as much as in her victories, a strange comfort. Her vulnerabilities are, in the end, the most enduring echo, crossing the boundaries of class, faith, and history. Part 9. The Queen's Footprints. Memory, Controversy, and the Path Ahead. Chapter 45. Debates and Commemoration. The farther history travels from Victoria's reign, the hotter the debates about her meaning become. In the 21st century, universities host seminars on the Victorian legacy, sometimes packed with admirers of her reforming zeal, sometimes with critics determined to dismantle every notion of her as a benevolent ruler. Local councils across the United Kingdom wrestle with the fate of her statues in public squares. Some citizens demand their removal, citing her status as Empress and the imperial violence entwined with her reign. Others argue for contextual plaques, education and discussion, not destruction, an ongoing dialogue between memory and conscience. Museums stage exhibitions entitled Unveiling Victoria, showcasing both the marvels of her time and its injustices. Lace-collared royal gowns opposite the mute witnesses of empire, like coins, treaties, and the faded, fraught photographs of distant colonies. Artists paint her as both jailer and liberator, as a mask behind which millions toiled, and as a complicated, wounded woman herself. Chapter 46. The Queen and Her Descendants. Victoria's bloodline threads through the royal houses of Europe, though not now always upon a throne. At family gatherings, weddings, christenings, descendants compare her diaries, letters, and the duties each inherits. For a few, this is a matter of constitutional responsibility and ceaseless scrutiny. For others, it is the peculiar inheritance of living history, both a privilege and a burden. In the British monarchy, her legacies remain alive. The Christmas broadcasts she began in their spirit, the charitable foundations, and the expectation that a monarch must be both seen and, at times, almost invisible. The family monarch, accessible, dignified, cautious, was almost entirely her invention, honed under the relentless gaze of an evolving press. From Balmoral's wild Scottish slopes to the formal gardens of Sandringham, every royal retreat carries her traces. On summer days and cold Scottish nights, children and grandchildren gather as their ancestors did, debating, joking, sometimes quarreling, but always aware they walk on ground she cultivated. Chapter 47. Victoria and the People's Stories. For every sovereign in marble, there are quiet family stories passed through generations. Tales of great-great-uncles who cooked in the royal kitchens, seamstresses who stitched lace for a princess's wedding, railway workers who saluted a black-shrouded train as Victoria's coffin made its last journey. During the coronavirus pandemic, Britons once again invoked the image of Victoria's stoicism, her instructions during crises, her compassion for the sick, her sense of shared national endeavor. The NHS, founded nearly half a century after her death, is sometimes described as the fulfillment of Victorian-era dreams for public health and service. Residents of former colonies recount their ancestors' first encounters with the Queen's peace, the mixed blessing of law and order imposed from far away. Some recall stories of resistance, others of unlikely liberation, the many-sided tale of empire and emancipation, of the hope and heartbreak that Victoria's reign set in motion. Chapter 48. We are not amused. The real person. Behind the phrase. It is a curiosity that the phrase so closely associated with Victoria, "We are not amused," was something she never publicly proclaimed, but which stuck to her image like a second crown. The real Victoria, as her diaries reveal, loved a good joke, relished music and theater, and, especially in youth and in private, had an impulsive, passionate side. Children reading her story today are struck by her vulnerabilities. The girl locked in Kensington, keeping secret diaries. The young queen learning her power, falling deeply for Albert, standing alone at her first Privy Council. The devastated widow, locking herself away from the world even as she ruled a quarter of it. Her tangled, contradictory humanity, sometimes irascible, sometimes visionary, always real, offers both warning and solace to those who study her closely. Chapter 49. Lessons for Leaders. Political theorists and statesmen continue to scrutinize Victoria's reign for lessons about the limits of personal power, the value of adaptation, and the wages of empire. Stateswomen and princes cite her life as an example, occasionally a cautionary tale, more often a source of inspiration for quietly tenacious leadership. The paradox is this: she was, by birth, set apart from her people, yet her life touched theirs at every level. The monarch became, through grief and endurance, more ordinary than many could have guessed, and so, paradoxically, more beloved. In times of crisis, prime ministers have quoted from her letters or diaries, sentiments about hope and perseverance that can resound long after the grandeur of empire and the strictures of the Victorian home have faded. Chapter 50. New Century, Old Questions. As the centuries turn, the figure of Queen Victoria stands guard at a threshold, not only in British history, but in modern identity, gender and power, race and nationhood, tradition and reform. New biographers strive to pull her out from behind the myths, yet she continues to elude simple definition. Still, at garden parties on the grounds of Windsor Castle, in debates in the halls of Parliament, in the hopes of politicians, and the everyday struggles of teachers and nurses and shopkeepers, her legacy lingers. What would Victoria do? Is asked in jest, sometimes in earnest. The question is perhaps less important than the act of asking, for it means the Queen and her era still live not in statues, but in imagination. Part 10. Remembrance, Renewal, and the Queen's Enduring Song. Chapter 51. Victoria in the Classroom. In classrooms from London to Lagos, Hong Kong to Halifax, the story of Queen Victoria is retold anew for each generation. Textbooks lay out the facts, the dates of her reign, the expansion of empire, the inventions, the wars, the reforms. But between the lines, children hear the tales of a determined girl denied a normal childhood, a young sovereign wading into a man's world, a woman whose grief shaped a nation's public mood. School projects and history lessons dig into the details of her life, her love for Albert, her relationships with prime ministers, her role in science and the arts. There are heated debates about the morality of empire, the meaning of progress, and the paradox of a queen so involved in family, who is sometimes distant from the true lives of her subject peoples. Some teachers praise her for bringing respectability and modernization. Others caution against the myth of her saintliness, emphasizing the mixed blessing of colonial expansion. What becomes clear with every lesson is this: Victoria remains a prism through which young people examine questions of gender and leadership, national identity, change, and resistance. She is a paradoxical role model. Flaws and virtues intermingle in her story as in real life. Chapter 52. Victoria in Modern Britain. Victoria's presence is felt in the city layout of modern London. Her iconic memorial outside Buckingham Palace, the leafy avenues bearing her children's names, the great train stations and public buildings constructed in her time. Yet more subtle is the way her sense of gravitas, routine, and quiet resilience became woven into the strands of Britishness. Whether in times of crisis, terror attacks, royal scandals, political reversals, or pandemic, commentators invoke stiff upper lip or carrying on, traditions partly crystallized during her 6 decades upon the throne. Every year, when Remembrance Day poppies bloom and the monarch stands solemnly before the cenotaph, there's something of Victoria's spirit in the public displays of mourning that are both communal and intensely personal. The floral tributes, the balancing of private emotion and public duty, all echo the woman who mourned for Albert not just as widow, but as national matriarch. In art and architecture, Victorian Gothic and eclecticism, once dismissed as overwrought, find new appreciation as expressions of optimism and seriousness, a visual metaphor for her reign, at once elaborate and enduring, mixing inherited wealth with daring new forms. Chapter 53. A Family for the World. Perhaps the greatest of Victoria's unintended legacies was her global family. The grandmother of Europe, they called her. So many royal weddings, so many photographs of small princes and princesses clustered around the white-haired sovereign. Even today, the interwoven bloodlines are visible from Oslo to Madrid, Stockholm to Bucharest. The world wars shattered much of this family of nations, but the relationships forged under Victoria's roof still matter in quiet, diplomatic ways. It is not only those of royal blood who call her family. In countries shaped by the Victorian diaspora, millions trace ancestry to those who sought new fortunes in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa. Emigrants who brought with them not only British customs, but also the ambition, anxiety, and contradictions of the age. Today, when people travel or communicate across continents, they pass through systems, postal services, rail networks, legal codes, university structures that were shaped, if not born, in her day. In this, the Victorian epic lingers as a set of invisible threads tying together disparate nations in an ever more complex world. Chapter 54. Victoria in Popular Culture. The face of Queen Victoria appears everywhere: canvas bags, postage stamps, bastions of fine chocolate and tea, across coin collections and television dramas. She is depicted as an imperious matron, a grieving widow, a lovesick teenager, a shrewd operator, sometimes all at once. Comedy sketches, novels, and cartoons lampoon her Victorian values, even as dramas mine the pathos of her personal life for fresh emotion. Modern film and theater explore her heartaches, her moments of pettiness and grandeur, revisiting her friendships with John Brown and Abdul Karim for what they reveal about race, class, and the profound isolation that comes with being so singular a monarch. Victoria's voice, once confined to diary and letter, is today almost omnipresent, woven into the tapestry of British and world identity. Chapter 55. Grief, Glory, and the Human Queen. Of all the many images that remain, perhaps the most resonant is Victoria as the grieving woman, her face shaded beneath a widow's bonnet, her eyes tired, but her hand still firm on pen or scepter. In the great dramas of state, as in the smallest moments, holding a grandchild, writing to a distant daughter, opening a new hospital or railway, she embodied the mixture of public and private life that defines the modern age. Visitors to Osborne House, walking in the gardens where Victoria once found solace, often report a strange intimacy, a sense that the old Queen's spirit has softened into something at once grand and infinitely personal. The statue on the lawn, the sunlight through the windows, the scent of distant sea. These things speak quietly of renewal after loss, of continuity, and of change. Chapter 56. Echoes in a Boundless Empire. Even as Britain's place in the world changed, empire transforming to commonwealth, and commonwealth again into a network of independent but sometimes intertwined nations, Victoria's reign became a touchstone. Diplomats, artists, and activists alike speak of a second Victorian age whenever the nation faces new crossroads. At state banquets and on ships that cross the world's oceans, at garden parties and school assemblies, in debates about what it means to remember and to belong, the question is asked again: what is the true cost of progress? Can justice and order walk hand in hand? What is the price of greatness, and who must pay? Through every answer, the figure of Victoria, small, persistent, complex, walks quietly, as if asking not for worship, but for honesty, to remember her mistakes as well as her triumphs, to acknowledge the tears as well as the praises.